Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
Everything seems impossible till it happens.
Everyone would be affected by a nuclear war.
Our government is planning to spend trillions of dollars to develop new nuclear weapons that we don't need.
You can't win a nuclear war.
We are all experts on nuclear weapons because we are all going to be affected by those nuclear weapons.
And here's today's guest host, Michelle Dover.
Thank you, Dal. Welcome to this week's episode of Press the Button. I'm Michelle Dover, Director of Programs here at Ploughshares Fund, and I am still hosting while Joe is out on vacation, though that is soon to come to an end. Today's news will be primarily focused on Iran and North Korea. We were joking earlier, it'll be all missiles all the time. In regards to Iran, the countries who have been a part of the Iran nuclear deal are undertaking diplomatic efforts to save the agreement, while last week we saw North Korea test a missile. Joining me on early warning to discuss these topics today are the Deputy Director of Policy here at Ploughshares, Mary Kaszynski, and Program Manager from the National Committee on North Korea, Daniel Wertz. The podcast today is special. It's dedicated to celebrating those who offer a creative and artistic lens on nuclear issues. Joe will be sitting down with Smriti Keshari, an artist and filmmaker known for her work on the nuclear multimedia exhibit and well-known film The Bomb, which you can see on Netflix if you haven't already. Then we have a special In the Silo spotlight profile on Lovely Umayam, who is the co-founder of the arts collective Bombshelltoe. For this episode 16, please comment, share, rate, and subscribe. And if you can also send us your questions, which we will have Joe answer on the podcast. Those questions can be sent to pressthebutton@ploughshares.org. Many thanks to everyone who has submitted those already. And now, the news.
And now, early warning. Early warning. Early warning. Early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
I'm sitting here in our Ploughshares headquarters here in DC on a not so hot Monday morning. I'm joined by our Deputy Director of Policy here at Ploughshares, Mary Kaszynski, and Program Manager from the National Committee on North Korea, Daniel Wertz. Thank you both for joining us. And Dan, special thanks for coming on. I know this is your first time on our show.
Well, thanks for having me, Michelle. Great to be here.
As you both know, we have 7 minutes this morning to deliver the news because that's about the amount of time a U.S. president would have to decide whether or not to respond to an incoming nuclear threat. If they can make that decision in 7 minutes, then we can do the news. Mary, I'm going to start with you on Iran. This weekend, we saw an emergency meeting in Vienna with officials from Iran, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and China. Basically everybody except the U.S. who signed up to the deal. And the point of the meeting was to see whether there was a way to save the agreement in light of the increasing tensions. We saw the tankers being taken. We saw a missile test by Iran. We've seen increasing sanctions by the U.S. since the withdrawal, and overall just a fraying of the agreement. Iranian officials said afterwards the meeting was constructive, but there are unresolved issues, and Tehran will continue to reduce its nuclear commitments if Europeans fail to salvage the pact. So the question is, do you think it's salvageable? What do we need to see from the parties in order to sustain it, knowing the U.S. is sending such mixed signals?
Well, it's absolutely salvageable, and I think that that's really the important takeaway, that, you know, the parties are still talking. They're still talking about what they could possibly do that would be acceptable to Iran. There was good news from the Iranian officials, said that this was important progress, and that's, again, you know, when your two options are a military conflict or continuing diplomacy, continuing these negotiations, we're on the right track. Now, the bad news is that Iran has announced that they might take some steps to further reduce their compliance with the nuclear agreement. It remains to be seen if they actually will take those steps or if the Europeans, Russians, and Chinese can put together some economic benefits, whether that's humanitarian trade or maybe a purchase of oil that would make it acceptable to Iran, that would make it worth Iran's time, worth their staying in the nuclear agreement. It remains to be seen, but this meeting was important progress. That's what we've heard from officials.
No, and I think, watching this tit for tat as, the U.S. puts on more sanctions, Iran announces another step, it just is a really big reminder that this is the reason we have the deal, is to keep Iran's program limited.
That's exactly right. And I think we're seeing also from U.S. officials who are saying that they really want Iran to continue complying, that, it was a good deal. It worked. And it would be extremely dangerous if this deal falls apart for U.S. security and for global security.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Mary. So turning to you, Dan, let's talk about North Korea. South Korean officials said on Thursday that North Korea launched 2 short-range missiles, which they described as a new kind of short-range ballistic missile. This was echoed by the North Korean state-run media reporting the next day that they had fired their new tactical guided weapon in a solemn warning to South Korean military warmongers. Why is North Korea launching missiles if we are still on this diplomatic path versus the fire and fury we saw, a year ago?
Well, 2 reasons, at least, short-term reasons. One, the U.S. and South Korea are set to resume military exercises next month, despite the fact, as President Trump promised somewhat offhandedly in Singapore a year ago, that U.S.-South Korea war games, as he called them, would cease. Now, the exercises that are to take place are significantly scaled down from the exercises that have taken place in past years. They're mostly computerized exercises this year. They're about transfer of operational control from a U.S.-led command during wartime to a joint U.S.-South Korea command. But the North Koreans, nonetheless, are very unhappy that exercises of any type are taking place. They're also upset that South Korea recently announced that it would go ahead with purchasing F-35 fighter planes from the United States.
So what has been the U.S. administration's response then to these, what some would call provocations?
Well, President Trump and to some extent Secretary Mike Pompeo have kind of played down the importance of these North Korean missile tests. The South Koreans seem more alarmed for their part, and I think North Korea clearly intended that to be the respective responses of the U.S. and South Korea. In the statement that North Korea put out announcing these tests, that was squarely aimed at South Korea. It didn't mention the U.S. They clearly want to keep some kind of decent relationship, at least with President Trump, alive for the time being. But North Korea, I think, has made the decision that it's time to put more pressure on South Korea at this time. Not only did they test these missiles, they unveiled a new submarine earlier in the week, and recently they indicated that they would reject a planned shipment of South Korean food aid to the North, which would be distributed through the UN agencies in the country, despite the fact that there is a significant food shortage that's been reported this year.
Wow. So we'll then have to just see how that affects any of the upcoming talks. Continuing the discussion on missiles, we've discussed on this show before about how the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, affectionately known as the INF Treaty, is about to end. This is a treaty that was made between the U.S. and at the time the Soviet Union in 1987, eliminated an entire class of weapons, all of the country's medium-range ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles, which had been seen as a sort of hair trigger for nuclear war because of their short flight times. The treaty has been deteriorating over the last decade, with both sides accusing each other of non-compliance, Russia developing systems that would violate the treaty, and Russia accusing the U.S. of unhelpful actions. And in February, Trump and Pompeo announced that the U.S. would suspend its obligations, withdraw 6 months later. That 6-month mark is this week. So we've discussed this a bit before, but I'm curious to hear what you think about what happens in this new world when INF is officially over. Mary, what are Europe's options? We've talked a lot about US and Russia, but Europe is a key player in this.
Right. Well, Europe's in a very difficult position. I mean, the whole reason we had this treaty, one, was to stop a new arms race, and Europe's the battleground for that new arms race. So, again, Europe is in a very difficult position. The U.S., under the Trump administration, particularly John Bolton, has been discussing building and deploying new INF missiles that would violate the INF treaty. So, once again, we are on the brink of a new arms race. Europe's options are very limited. It's a very dangerous situation.
And Dan, a few people here in Washington have talked about China being brought into a new round of talks to try to create a bigger, better INF. What do you think? What is the likelihood of that?
I think a trilateral IMF would be wonderful, but very unrealistic to expect something, at least in the foreseeable future. I think that, this idea of a trilateral U.S., Russia, China arms control agreement is, kind of an excuse for people who want to throw bilateral U.S., Russia arms control treaties by the wayside. And keep in mind that it's the U.S. and Russia that have 90% of the nuclear weapons in the world, and bilateral U.S., Russia arms control continues to be extremely important.
And with that is the news. For this week, as we prepare for the anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I do encourage you to start reading the articles that are starting to come out. First, the article in the National Interest on the impact of nuclear weapons testing, written by Ploughshares' own Alex Spire and Zach Brown. And with that, we'll catch you next week.
We're sitting in the glass-enclosed headquarters of Ploughshares, D.C., with the traffic on L Street overlooking the Washington Monument, and I'm delighted to be sitting here with Smriti Keshari, someone that I've known for several years now. She is a film director, an artist. Her work covers traditional linear filmmaking to art installations. She's perhaps best known for her multimedia installation, The Bomb, which Entertainment Weekly called a stunning avant-garde approach to a plea for nuclear disarmament. And we were together just last night at the Washington, D.C. premiere of The Bomb. Thank you for joining me, Smriti.
Thank you for having me, Joe. It all started from Eric Schlosser's book, Command and Control. I read the book and it left this profound effect on me. I'm often drawn to these forces that you can't see but are seemingly inescapable. And the book left this profound effect on me, and it made me feel both quite sad and quite angry. And I think sad because I couldn't believe this nuclear reality that we live in a world with almost 14,000 nuclear weapons. And angry because it didn't have that same effect on me that I think it did for a lot of people who were alive or young during the Cold War or Cuban Missile Crisis. And there was almost this amnesia or denial of the threat that nuclear weapons pose. I remember after reading the book wanting to just go to people and just tell them, do you know how many nuclear weapons we have? I was just so angry because I knew nothing about it. And so the idea really came from conversations with Eric of how could we create an experience that's not didactic, that is not telling you, but really taking you on a journey. And that's one of the things that people often say, and someone said it last night, is that The Bomb is something that feels like happens to you versus something you watch.
Yeah, why don't you tell people a little bit of what the experience is like? This is not a regular film. This is not an instructional video or a lecture on nuclear disarmament. Describe what you've done.
There is no talking head, I tried to get in it. You turned me down flat. Good. For the next one.
For the next one.
The Bomb really takes you on this emotional journey of nuclear weapons. And what I mean by that is that for so many people, and this was the case with me, we don't know what a nuclear weapon actually even looks like. Right? And it's so hard to have an emotional connection to an abstraction. So how can you seduce people first? How can you introduce them to it? And then by being introduced, by understanding the power that it has, the ingenuity that it has, you can really also get a sense of the power that it has to destroy as well, how it has been used, how it has been validated, the perversion of science and sort of the making of it, and ultimately also kind of where we are now, the noise where we are now.
So to do that, you surround us in the bomb.
Exactly.
I first saw it in New York. You had 6 screens. Last night at the National Academy of Sciences, you had 4 screens.
Yeah.
So everybody's packed in, standing up, go around these screens.
Yeah, so the film happens all around you. It's 30-foot high screens, 8 of them in New York, 4 of them.
Sorry.
Yeah, we like to go big.
That was great. That was great.
4 of them here in the beautiful National Academy of Science Great Hall. And the audience is actually in the center of it. And I think there's this sort of not knowing what to do with yourself.
Yes,
that
a little
really
unease. Yeah.
Forces, it almost like lifts the veil of comfort, because we all know how we watch movies, right?
Yeah.
I always put one foot over the other and I'm ready to be entertained. But when you have to engage more of your senses, when you don't know if you're paying attention to the band or the film and it's all around you, that it just makes you more vulnerable and susceptible.
Right, we should tell people it was a live performance by The Acid, the band you've had from the beginning. The
Yeah.
boys were great last night.
So The Acid, it's been such an amazing creative partnership with them. And to be honest, when we were we powered through Kevin Ford, the co-director with Eric and I, we powered through 400 hours of footage. And we were sort of thinking through, like, how are we kind of crafting this story? And it was through a lot of conversations with Adam Freeland of The Acid and the other guys as well, of a good DJ set. And a good DJ set takes you through this, like, emotional roller coaster. You know, you can't just go up, 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 and up, because you have nowhere to go. So you have to really kind of, it's this bell curve of emotion that you're taking them through. And that was really what we looked at when taking them through when crafting the film itself. So before you know if a nuclear weapon is bad or good, it's a beautiful machine. Yes. And if you like Jaguars, if you like hardware, this is the most powerful machine ever built. So how can we introduce that ingenuity, that like excitement in the building of it? That a lot of weapon designers have. I've had conversations with them, and there is this like attachment, because it is just ingenuity of construct.
If people don't have the chance to see this live, and it doesn't perform very often, this is a major project to stage this. In fact, how many times have you staged it?
So live
New York, Oslo.
Mm-hmm. We were at the Berlinale.
Berlin.
Nobel Peace Prize ceremony in Oslo. We were at Sydney Festival. We were at Glastonbury.
Yes, the rock concert. What was that like?
After Radiohead.
Yeah.
You know, it's really interesting, because at every single showing, there's a different reaction.
Yes.
And last night was one of the most like emotional ones. And I think because we're in like the capital of the country, I think there's this sort of, the audience was tremendous, and there were people in tears, and you could see each other more. There was like jaws that were really dropped.
So if people want to get a taste of this, is it still available on Netflix?
It is, yeah. So the bomb's on Netflix, Amazon, all of them.
So you can get a taste of what it's like, but you really have to experience it.
Yeah, I would say so. I think there's just something about also staring at others and having this shared experience.
Okay, so you meet up with Eric when you're doing the movie Food Chains.
Yeah,
right?
So Eric was the
with
executive.
Eva Longoria,
Mm-hmm.
and I think this is where I first met you. I went up for the premiere and so met you guys there. It was very glamorous. It was very exciting. But this is a film about agricultural workers. It comes from Eric's one of his first books, Fast Food Nation. And so, but then by then he's working on Command and Control. So you must have got involved in this while he's still writing the book.
No, so while filming Food Chains and while being in the fields of Florida, of tomato fields and strawberry fields and grape fields, I remember thinking what we're trying to do with this film of kind of having people understand the reality of farm workers in the U.S. If they could just be here, if they could be in this field, you would feel the weight the power of the sun, like how hard the labor is. And that switch of empathy would happen immediately. So that's where I had been starting to think about how can something be really all around a person? How can you actually bring the subject matter to them, not something that they're learning? And so I started looking at research on time perception and memory as it relates to what we see. Everything that we consume for the most part is this one-way, one-directional relationship. Something's on a screen or on a wall at a gallery or on stage being projected at you. But what would it be like if it was actually all surrounding? So how does changing the viewing method change your actual relationship with a subject?
That's interesting.
English is also my third language. And people always like say, I'm really into Andy Warhol. I'm really into David Byrne. But you're not really in it, right? It's being projected at you. So what would it be like if you were in it? And I'm Indian, and music often comes from the center of the space as well. And so I thought, what would it be like if we kind of use those elements and we lifted a veil of comfort of what you're supposed to do as an audience to really kind of penetrate through, create a deeper relationship with the subject. So Eric and I had been talking about this for years. I had got turned on to the subject after the book came out. And he, during writing it, he was listening to incredible electronica music. He was in the marches at Hyde Park and Central Park. And hearing those stories and what it felt like, knowing what it was like during the 80s and during the 90s, I think in so many ways it was really being able to recreate that experience for a younger generation.
Right, because the bomb doesn't present the same way that it did. I mean, not the film, but the actual discussion about nuclear weapons don't present the same way as they did 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 70 years ago. Okay, and so let's talk about that for a little bit. And you explored this in the film about the way nuclear weapons are sold to the American public. You show a Lockheed Martin ad, and the words that are used: power, safety, responsibility, safe and sure. What do you think about the way even well-meaning people involved in the nuclear enterprise sell their product?
Yeah. So this is something I think about all the time, and I'm so invested in the issue that I still I read about this and have conversations about this. There's this sense that reading nuclear strategy oftentimes it feels like you're lulled into this assurance. But then when you get deeper and deeper into it, you realize that each one of the kind of avenues leads to a paradox. And it's so hard to fully grasp it because of the language and the way that the language actually keeps people away. It's really hard to engage in something when there's so many acronyms. And there's this sense that someone's taking care of it.
Yes.
That this is okay. But as we know,
it's under control.
Exactly. And there's this illusion of control, really. But as we know by Eric's book and the Damascus incident, that we ignore the fact that at the end of the day, these are machines. And a machine, whether it's your microwave or if it's your car, will fail. And it does fail. So again and again and again, we've been face to face with these accidents and incidents. And do we really, we have low combat missiles that are stronger than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah.
And so this isn't sort of an argument of, no, let's not have weapons, we need a defense system. It's more, we've created these Godzillas, these mutations.
Yeah, you say in one of your interviews that one of your first motivations for doing the bomb was to allow people to understand the, quote, the ultimate death wish that lies at the very heart of these weapons. What do you mean by that?
I feel like that's quite a controversial statement now that I'm here in D.C.
Well, that's because in D.C., we talk about these things very dryly. It's all about strategy and deterrence and strength and contracts.
Right.
And we don't talk about what the weapons actually do.
Right. Going through all of the documents of even looking at the power of them, there are terms like mega death. Which is and there are things like if you drop it exactly at this moment, you can have the most massive amount of impact. There's so much work and process being done to make them, to modernize them. And I do believe that we do need to modernize some of them. but there's a hard sense for people to even know, like, is this modernization or is this an upgrade?
Yes.
And for most of the population, it's just so hard to even get to that point. I recently made a short video on how to dismantle a nuclear weapon.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and again, we should watch it after this. It's just 2 minutes long, and to the point that I had this like Last Supper dinner with like all these weapons designer and all of these people, and no one could break it down simply. And I remember it was 4 months of process of just trying to get to the bottom of like, well, no, the primary goes to Oak Ridge Lab, Tennessee, highly enriched unit, how that gets diluted, and no one really knows. And these are the people who are like really working on it. They know one small aspect of it.
Let me ask you to carry on for that. What's the hope of the work that you're doing, the bomb and the other artistic works you're doing on this? What do you want people to do with this experience? Where do you hope this all goes? Politically, strategically, analytically.
I think this is something I get asked all of the time about, like, why nuclear weapons, and also like now kind of moving into the world of artificial intelligence. You know, I think there the sense that there are these like silent forces that control us or have this huge impact on us, and oftentimes we just don't have like the virtue or the opportunity to be able to see that. And so I hope with all of my work, it really allows people to just understand it more in a way that is more approachable. You know, language is something I think about all the time because I grew up speaking Hindi and then Spanish and then English. And language is beautiful because it can connect us, but it can also alienate us. And you know, for a lot of people, I think story obviously has a way of connecting you deeper to a subject matter. But when you're talking about something so mechanical and something that you can't touch or you can't see, how do you get them to like have that agency to feel like not only can they understand it, they can approach someone and talk about it, and then they can start to do something by it. So I'm excited, you know, at how the arts can also do that, obviously. I mean, bringing in a rock and roll band and amazing, like, creative artists together. We had the artistic director of Radiohead who did all of our artwork as well. It's an issue he cares about as well.
So, Smriti, if people want to know more about you, where can they go? Where can they find your work or your
they
webpage?
Can't. I'm burrowed. I'm in.
Give us a little bit. Give us a little bit of where they might go. Do you have a web page?
I have a website. Yeah.
Good.
I was
What's
like,
that?
It is my first name and my last name. And if anyone can spell that on their first try, I would just love to meet them.
You're talking to a guy named Cirincione. Sure, Smriti Keshari is not that hard. We'll include the link in the podcast link.
Great.
So thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure.
This has been fun.
For this episode of Press the Button, we go back in the silo, where we shine a spotlight on the grantees helping Ploughshares Fund reach its vision of a world where nuclear weapons can never be used again.
Nuclear has been an ever-present force in my professional life, but as I strive to be this well-rounded nuclear policy nerd, I also proudly identify as a writer and a creative. And as you can imagine, those two things don't mix so well.
That's Lovely Umayam, speaking at a recent pop tech conference about how the word nuclear touches our very core. In addition to being an analyst at the Stimson Center, a nonprofit DC think tank, Lovely is founder of Bombshelltoe, an arts collective that places a creative and cultural lens on nuclear issues. Bombshelltoe was the first prize winner of the U.S. Department of State's 2013 Innovation and Arms Control Challenge. More recently, Ploughshares Fund awarded a grant to support Lovely's Ways of Knowing multimedia project about Navajo Nation's health and tradition through its enduring and traumatic encounter with uranium mining in New Mexico. Press the Button had a chance to talk a bit with Lovely about how she balances the creative and analytical sides of life. But first, a quick primer on the spirit of Bombshelltoe from Ploughshares Fund Program Director Michelle Dover.
So Bombshelltoe, if you have your phone in front of you, you have to look it up. Bombshelltoe.com. It's a website, and everything about it, from its name to its design, is this mashup of nuclear policy and nerdiness with pop culture. And even the name, Bomb, and then, Shell-toe, the Adidas shoe. And this, I think, perfectly represents Lovely's ability to walk in multiple worlds.
So what does the word nuclear mean to Lovely?
I think initially I was a layperson as well, where nuclear meant nothing to me. If anything, it meant pop culture references by way of really bad Hollywood movies that use it as a plot device.
Homer, this is an exact replica of your workstation. Now we're going to simulate a power surge in core sector 8.
What the hell are you talking about?
One of Lovely's specialties is tracking down nuclear stories that tend to slip through history's cracks.
Argentina and Brazil was a really interesting case study because they're two countries in Latin America that in the 90s ended up rolling back their aspirations to pursue nuclear weapons. And they were, regional rivals. There was a point where there was a lot of tension between the countries, and nuclear weapons was definitely part of their posture. They mutually rolled back. And to me, that's like a really interesting story because you wouldn't necessarily think Argentina and Brazil as nuclear countries, but they have a very deep history that isn't just about the material or the weapon.
Or soccer,
but something about each other, right? And their perceptions of each other as neighbors.
So this is totally news to my family's from South America, so I'm fascinated by this. Okay. So this, because I want to make jokes about they just don't have their act together to actually come up with a nuclear program. But do they actually have any, other than nuclear power, do they have an actual nuclear weapons ambitions?
No, they do not anymore. But a lot of people don't know that they used to.
I was going to say, that's kind of amazing that these stories just kind of come and then they go. That's
so they used to. I think that's like a very unique case that most people don't think about because we've been saturated with, I think, examples of nuclear as purely just from the North Korea perspective or purely from the Iran perspective. But my argument through Bombshelltoe is there's different modes of understanding the word and how it represents emotionally and culturally to people. And at least from my experience working with artists, talking to my friends and family, that becomes the way that they get engaged in the pressing issues of our time, like Iran or North Korea.
For Lovely, balancing her creative and analytical sides helps inform a give-and-take spirit when exchanging ideas with poets from the Marshall Islands or storytellers from the Navajo Nation. The policy of art becomes a convener.
I would say that art is a really great convener of different stakeholders. If I, as an analyst from DC, go to Navajo Nation with a 30-page report, that's not really going to resonate.
Yeah. You see, we're putting the cover sheets on all TPS reports now before they go out.
Whereas if I approach them, humbly and open-minded and saying, a lot of my nuclear knowledge comes from DC, I'd really like to know your lived experience.
It's a give and take.
It's an exchange. And I want, the opportunity to give because I understand that for most of these communities, most people end up taking from there more so than giving.
Or thinking they're giving when they're really taking.
Yes, exactly. And art becomes that, creative exchange. And that's the reason why I see the power in art and bringing that into this community. There's got to be a bit of wonder in what we do. What Bombshelltoe is trying to encourage is just a little bit more creativity, not necessarily dumbing down or watering down the policy, but rather transforming what we know into something that's palatable and salient to other people.
To learn more about Lovely Umayam's creative work, visit bombshelltoe.com. That's toe with an E. bombshelltoe.com. To follow Lovely's analytical work, visit Stimson.org. Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil and Zach Brown. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.